luncheon, a parade, and a dinner. I'm going to have to sit down.
Your Majesties, welcome to Downton Abbey.
Hi everyone, my name is Jacqueline. I'm an editor here at Rotten Tomatoes, and I'm beyond excited because I'm here today with two members of the cast of Downton Abbey. And Hugh, Elizabeth, thank you guys so much for being here. I'm beyond excited. I think anyone who's seen the show is going to love the movie, but the great thing about the movie is you don't have to have seen the show to love it, so I appreciate that one. But let's just talk about some of the biggest moments from the show, and one that I think will live in my heart because it killed me was Sybil's death. Oh. It nearly broke y'all's marriage. I was so worried that it was
Yeah.
What was it like filming that one and that whole week or weeks that y'all were doing it?
Well, in some ways, of course, it's very tragic, but in other ways, it was the greatest pleasure because it was so well written. As soon as I read it, I thought this writing is just a gift, and it doesn't come along in an actor's career very often. So, I mean, of course, it was heartbreaking, but on the other hand, I personally just enjoyed the subtlety. I felt like Julian had mastered the arc of grief in the episode, the kind of phases that you go through, and also the strain that grief does put on a relationship because people deal with it in such different ways, and it often does divide people. So I felt that he really mastered that seemingly so effortlessly, and I appreciated it.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary sequence, that, because there's the false hope that she's given birth and it's all fine, and then this utterly tragic end of the eclampsia section. And then, yes, as you say, all these different emotions that come into play, and the sense of blame and guilt and distance and
could I have done something differently?
Could one, what should we have done differently? And for once, Dr. Clarkson was probably right, and all these things.
For once is right.
Yeah, Dr. Death was actually right. And Robert was so stubborn about it, and how Harley Street and these posh doctors must be the way forward, and all that. And then to have this, I thought, exquisitely navigated sequence in which it's Violet who brings the healing power onto the relationship. And I never forget, I mean, Elizabeth was extraordinary. We were shooting this scene where there's a final reconciliation in Violet's house, and we were right up against it that day. Do you remember? And it was like 5 to 7, and we had to wrap at 7. We don't do overtime in Britain. And Elizabeth was being called on to do something quite remarkable, under real time pressure. And you were amazing that day. It was a special sequence. That, yeah.
The funny thing about it is it would never have come about if Jessica Brown Findlay didn't have such a good agent.
Yeah.
It was really her decision to leave the show.
Yeah, some of the most traumatic deaths.
Or a bad agent, whatever you look.
Julian gets the bad rap, but it's like, well, they wanted to leave, so he had to make
absolutely.
Yeah, but that's what's so fun is that the series you're kind of responding to all these sort of things that are thrown at you.
And so in one way, and so like with Matthew Crawley, when Dan wanted to leave for the same reason, all our contracts were up, and Jess and Dan are quite openly said, we're going to move on. But Dan was slightly hesitant for a little while, and so Julian Fellowes kept the door open for him, as Julian being the writer. But it did come to a moment in June or July, I think, or certainly towards the end of his writing period, where he said, "I now need an answer. Are you staying or are you going? Because I either." I'd like to keep the door open, and perhaps you could come back for a couple of episodes in the next season, and then we could, have you die gently then, or disappear in whatever way we come up with. And that actually Jan said, no, I think it's best to make a clean break. So that meant there was only one way, and it was called a tree.
Yeah, and then everyone cried on Christmas.
Yeah.
That's Jan Stevens' decision.
Another big moment I think was another shared moment for you guys was the maybe air where you lost the baby at the end of season 1, and I think that was another great shared moment for you guys because you both got to have very big moments for the characters, and it really set up a lot. That was when I was like, okay, I liked the show, now I'm like, I love it, and it's gonna make me cry every moment. So talk about that whole sequence.
It was strange, because on the one hand it's almost comedic, the way in which you've got the bar of soap and bang, there's a sort of end of the pregnancy. That was all a bit odd in very truncated storytelling. But the fact that there was going to be this whole new direction, that the whole line of Matthew Crawley being this new successor was actually going to change direction.
Yeah.
Was really really interesting, and made everyone sort of sit up and take notice. But but then the skullduggery of Sarah O'Brien being a wicked person and bringing harm against her mistress was changed the course yet again.
There's only a few times they got you to cry on the show, and like holding back with Bates or kind of letting go with Bates. I still rewind that one if I need to cry. But let's talk about the comedy of it, and I think there's no better comedy than Maggie Smith and the Dowager Countess, because I think she's got obviously all the best lines. Everybody calls her her favorite character. Do you have a favorite one-liner that she gave?
For me, it's hard to beat "What is a weekend?"
That's pretty great.
That was early on.
There was. There's one in the movie actually, which I think is a really good one. I never apologise. I explain.
Yes, that's very great. And then I also want to talk about, you guys had a great showdown towards the end of the series about the hospital, and that was also another great moment because you got to see Cora in her element and like that whole dynamic, because it was a different moment. I think the first time, the Earl kind of had to be shown what he had. It was great.
Yeah, that was. Yeah, he was often being quite stubborn and pig-headed as a character, that he would really not see what was in front of his face and what was plainly obvious to most people. And the idea of Cora having this role, and this important and respected role in the community. And of course, it superseded Robert's own selfish needs or whatever. For him to realise that of how central she was to the running of the estate and the community was a good wake-up call for him.
Oh, that was awesome. Do you have a favorite episode, or is it like picking your kids?
It is a bit like picking your kids. Do you have any?
I think my favorite is sort of the arc of the whole first year, really. I just think the way that everything was placed was so satisfying. I love it all, but if I had to pick, I wouldn't pick an episode, but I would pick the first year.
Yeah, but then, funnily enough, in fact, the sequence you talked about, I think in terms of the shock for the audience of Sybil's passing, and then what happened in the aftermath in terms of our relationship.
Yeah.
And then there's
that's good.
There's the unforgettable moment when Maggie Smith has to sort of step up to the plate and be the matriarch and be the mother hen of everyone. And that tiny beat where she walks across the hallway and falters for a moment, and you see.
Oh God, yes.
You see her own frailty.
That was an amazing.
And it was just really fine writing, because the audience is they know exactly what she's thinking and what she represents, and then she falters, and then
that falter said so much.
And then she straightens up and just carries on into the drawing room to be the matriarch, or the queen bee, as it were.
It was so English.
Yeah.
And so beautifully expressed.
Yeah, so I loved that whole section there, even though painful as it was.
Yeah, and you talk about the writing. I mean, let's talk about Julian. I mean, he's the guru of period drama from Gosford Park and just everything else. What's it like working with Julian? And then like him writing the script for this new movie, really?
Yeah, I don't think everybody appreciates the fact that he writes every single word of Downton Abbey, the series, which is so unusual. Most of the time people have writers' rooms and things like that, and it just is even more mind-boggling how one man's imagination can embody so many different characters from so many different classes and interweave them and keep all the stories alive. And also he has this gift for saying so much so economically, which is why he can keep all these characters afloat in this tapestry. And you'll have sometimes you read the script and you think, well, I only have one or two lines, there's nothing there. But actually, when you come to shoot it, there's so much there in each line that is perhaps not immediately evident on the page, but it's palpable when you're up and you're surrounded by what was actually in his imagination in reality.
And over the years, one got to understand his technique and why the scripts were by and large, page turners, and from that very first pilot, I remember reading it and wanting to know what happened next to these people that one was, engaged with so many different characters so vividly, who were so vivid and whose lives I wanted to follow. And really, I think a very simple technique. Two things he talked about structurally as a writer. He's a great fan of shows like The West Wing and a British soap called Coronation Street. So you've got these multiple storylines with shortish scenes, but in this classical context. So you haven't got pages and pages and pages all in one drawing room. You might have 20 or 40 seconds in one room and then you're off somewhere else. So these plates are kept spinning and these stories are kept alive, as you would do with a fast-moving show like The West Wing or a soap. The other thing he nearly always did, was you would enter a scene in one story, and halfway through the scene another story would evolve, and you'd leave the scene with a new piece of information. So there was always a forward momentum. And that's just a writing technique, and it took me a while to see what it was, but how effective it is, because it just keeps the pulse of the story going as much as you're enjoying being with the characters.
Yeah. I think part of that is the thing that surprised me. I didn't even realize until after I'd gotten to know Julian quite a bit, because he's quite a highbrow guy, as you can imagine. I mean, he knows so much. He just has one of those brains, but he watches soap opera. I mean, the English equivalent of it.
Writing them too.
Well, I think that's the thing is he embraces that, because it's all the plots, it's the stories, and so it's that combination of the two.
And I think that's why fans love it. That's why people like me are obsessed and go to the tours and then have to go to Highclere Castle. Which absolutely I did.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, you can even book it now on Airbnb, which I will say that's a thing. But let's talk about the Downton fans. What's the difference between the British versus the American fans? Because I would gather that they appreciate it differently.
Well, there's the line that I've said many, many times, which Rob James Collier, who plays Thomas Barrow, quoted. He came up with, which is brilliant, which is that in America people cross the street to tell you how much they love the show, and in Britain they cross the street to tell you they don't watch it. which is
a compliment, a British compliment.
Yeah.
You'll understand that if you live there a couple of years. You know you've arrived when they make the time to say that.
Yeah. Which is very true, but there is, I mean, don't get me wrong, there is actually a huge affection for the show in Britain and all over the world. But there is something special in the American attitude. I mean, I think the whole dressing up for viewing parties is quite probably not unique to America, but it's possibly more common in America than it is in Britain.
I don't know what you mean.
You've never
know what
done
you
that.
mean. Never done that. Who's been the most surprising fan, real quick, before we get out of here, that you've had about Downton? Because I heard Mick Jagger's a Downton fan?
Mick Jagger was a fan. Mick Jagger came over to two of the girls at the Met Ball and said, "All right, I love, it's a shame what happened to the younger one, isn't it?" And then I happened to have an encounter with Ronnie Wood from the Stones, and we met up actually, and because of his obsession with Downton, which is so I love the idea of the Stones.
Oh, in the studio.
They're all tuning up on tour and
put your guitars down.
I've got to hurry up this session. Got to get back for 9 o'clock.
And then the Queen too, maybe is it?
I don't know.
Not sure about that.
I don't know
maybe.
That's
Okay,
verified.
I've heard a rumor that maybe
We would
the
love
Queen
you.
You would know better than we.
Okay.
We'll take your word.
One last one real quick. We live in a time where not everybody loves rich people, but everybody loves you guys. Why do you think people still love Downton, even though it's so opulent, and especially Americans?
I don't think people begrudge rich people if they're courteous, if they're kind, if they respect others, if they have good grace about them. Good grace and good manners cost nothing, and I think in a world in which our public discourse is really being reduced to a megaphone, I think the courtesy and good manners of people like the Crawleys and the people they work with and who work for them, that goes a long way.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Everyone, please go see Downton Abbey, the movie. It's absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you.